Hi, everybody. I'm here with John Lande, a professor at the University of Missouri School of Law. And John, thank you so much for joining us in this course and agreeing to speak with our students. John he won't like me saying this, but has not only been in the negotiation and dispute resolution field for many, many years, he is also one of its wisest members. And I'm so glad that you're able to join our course, John. Thank you.
My pleasure to be with you.
John, at this point in our course, students have spent the past couple of weeks learning about different negotiation models. They've learned a distributive positional bargaining model, and we've also spent a week on getting to yes and integrative models. And I wanted to hear your thoughts in general on the topic of models and any insights you might have on that.
Great. Well, it's my pleasure. Again, thanks for inviting me. I got started in the field in 1980. Well, I graduated from law school in 1980, and I started mediation in 1982. Part of my inspiration was reading Getting to Yes, which had just come out. And those models really spoke to me, and of course it spoke to a lot of people. It's become a bestseller, and it's a basic text and reflects the basic theory and negotiation field. And so I've been teaching, and I teach in the law school now, and just like lots of people. And I've accepted this as this is the way negotiation works. And I recently did a study. I did interviews with lawyers asking them about how they negotiated, and I particularly asked them to describe the last case that they handled, starting from the very first time that they met with their client until they settled the case. And what I found was that these negotiation models in Getting to Yes do accurately describe some cases, but not others. So part of and what I also did was I looked at law school negotiation texts to see how the models were defined. And one of the things I found was there wasn't really a clear definition, a consistent one, not one that necessarily matched with Getting to Yes. So there was some confusion about what the models were, but there are a whole bunch of different variables that were all put together. So on the distributive or positional negotiation model, you have the idea that people are going to be exchanging offers. You're going to start with extreme positions. So if you have a buyer, the buyer is going to offer the very lowest amount. The seller is going to be asking for the very highest amount. And then they're going to be this exchange of offers back and forth. And each side is going to try and make the smallest possible concession to reach a result as close to them as possible. So that's this process of exchanging offers. The positional negotiation model assumes that people are selfish. They're always going to try and get as much for them as they can. The assumption being that it's a zero-sum game. More for me means less for you, and vice versa. Tends to assume that the negotiators are not very friendly, that they're going to try and use power tactics to try and get advantage. And so that's all those package of things fit together as positional negotiation. And I found that there were some cases that were like that.
Sure.
I also found some interest-based negotiation cases where you sort of have the opposite model, where you have people who, instead of exchanging offers and counteroffers, they will first start off by talking about what their interests are, and then try and identify a number of options that might satisfy their interests, and then have a discussion to see if they can come up with an option, agree on an option that will satisfy both people's interests. Right. And this is one based on an assumption that people it's not zero-sum, that you can find options that are going to make hopefully both sides better off, or at least one side better off without harming the other side. It's assumed that you're going to be fairly friendly. It's assumed that you're not going to be using power tactics so much. And also the norms here are about the party's interests as opposed to external objective norms like the law or industry standards.
Right.
So those are the two basic models, and I found that there were some cases like that. I also found a third model which doesn't show up in the negotiation theory, which I have called ordinary legal negotiation, but people do it other times even if it's not in a legal context. And instead of having an exchange of offers and counteroffers or a discussion of of interest, people just talk, and they often will talk about sort of the situation and sort of what makes sense. And they are somewhat friendly. They aren't necessarily trying to maximize each other's interests. They aren't presumably using power. In some ways, it may be somewhat more like interest-based negotiation, but it's really not this explicit process of identifying interests and an option. So an example of it, well, you've talked about the positional, but for example, I had a case where if I'm actually now about to release my car, so I'm about to go to deal with these car dealerships, and so I'm going to be asking to pay the very least I can, and they're going to be actually, I've started this process and they are offering a high number, and I know that the first number they offer is way high, and I have to demand a very low number, so we're going to have an exchange of offers and counter offers, so that hopefully we'll end up with something.
And that's straight out of positional bargaining.
That's straight positional bargaining. So, people do this all the time.
Right.
Interest-based negotiation, I've been trying to think about real life cases. One of the lawyers I interviewed talked about a property boundary dispute, and they negotiated an agreement in principle first. I'm not quite sure what the elements were, and there were a variety of different issues. And then after they negotiated the agreement in principle, then they worked out the details. And so that's actually along the lines of an interest-based negotiation. When I did divorce mediation, I use this all the time. And then as an example of an ordinary legal negotiation that people might use in daily life is when I go out to dinner with my wife and we're trying to figure out where we're going to go to eat. And so we might say, well, how hungry are we? Do I feel like Chinese or American? How far do we want to travel? Those sorts of general things. And it's a conversation. So there are those models, and these things happen in real life, but they don't always happen.
Right, but let me just point out that even though you just say that it's kind of the third model that you point out, the ordinary model, even though you say, well, we just talk about it, you've still managed not to leave it at that, general, description of people just talk, but rather to break it down into it's still a model. They talk, and here's how they talk about it, and here's what they talk about.
Absolutely. Well, and I mean, I refer to it as ordinary legal negotiation because in the legal context, there are legal norms. And so what happens is if you have a prosecutor and a defense counsel, and they're negotiating a plea bargain for a criminal defendant, they know that for an armed robbery with these circumstances, that the typical sentence, the typical plea bargain is going to be, X number of years of prison. And so that's the starting point for the negotiation. And they may deviate from that more or less depending on the circumstances, but it's based on those norms. In the negotiation with my wife about where to go out to eat, the norms are, well, there are certain places we like to go, and there are certain things that we do. And so that's sort of the starting point. It's not that I'm going to start by asking for my extreme position, and she's not going to be asking for her extreme position, and we're going to negotiate into someplace in the middle, nor are we going to be saying, well, let's see, let's identify all of our interests, and then let's identify all of the options. Although actually sometimes when we are looking to go out to eat, we do something like that. Right. So I don't know, some of the students in this class may be crazy enough to use the the interest-based negotiation to decide where they're going to go out to eat.
Well, some of the crazy teachers in this course have certainly done it, and I'm sure that some of the crazy students will do it also. And I mean, in those special occasions where you really are in touch with either your own, primary motivator for going out to eat, or with your counterpart's primary motivator, is I really just want someplace where we can sit and talk. I mean, that's an interest-driven place. So you're looking for a place where we can dig into a great hamburger, or you're looking for a place where we can really just connect. So sometimes those find their way into the conversation. Sometimes they're even, a primary part of it. But I understand what you're saying. That's not what's necessarily driving the conversation.
Right, and it may or may not, and in some ways that kind of leads to the conclusion I came to in my study, which is that in real life you don't have these clear, clean models. So you'll have some mixtures of them, and particularly in legal cases where you have a dispute that may go on over a period of months or years. You may have different models at different times or different pieces of different models in normal everyday negotiations, even a negotiation over where you're going to go out to eat or a negotiation over buying a car. There may be different points where you'll have different elements of it. So part of what I concluded in my study is that these models actually can be confusing and counterproductive because people often think they know what they mean, and they assume that all these elements, these variables go together, but they don't always go together. And so what I have suggested is that it's better to think about the variables that comprise the model and then consider that they may vary over the course of a negotiation.
So instead of naming a model and saying, we are now negotiating an X model, we are now negotiating with the Y model, let's look at the various elements, you call them variables, that are present in negotiation, and focus our negotiation understanding on becoming attuned to those variables, being able to name things as they happen or as we plan, and then formulate them either into a plan or into the action in the room or our reconstruction afterwards when we're trying to fix things, and using them in those senses.
Very well put.
So what are those variables?
Well, I'm glad you asked. So let me tell you about them. And these are the variables in the models that I'm just talking about, and there could be many others, but the ones that I focused on were the process of communication. Is it being done by an exchange of offers and counteroffers? Is it being done by a process of identifying interests and options? Is it being done by a process of referring to norms? So that's one variable. A second one is, are people looking to create value or not? Is the assumption that it's a zero sum, which I assume students will know about by this point, or is there an effort to try and find some arrangement that's going to, where people have differences of value so that you can come up with some arrangement that's going to be better for both parties, or at least for one, without harming the other. So that's a second one. A third one is the friendliness of the tone, which actually is something that people get confused about. They often think that interest-based negotiation, basically what that means is you're friendly, positionally, that you're hostile. And in fact, that's not the case. People exchange offers and counteroffers. When I'm doing it with the car dealer, we can be perfectly friendly. And we don't necessarily use power tactics. I've been going to several different dealers, and I can tell you we're using positional negotiation in every one of them, but they're using different tactics and different friendliness qualities. So it's useful to kind of mix and match the variables and recognize that they're not all, it's not a dichotomy that you're either friendly or not. You can be, it's a variable continuous scale. So the use of power tactics, and then the use of norms or interests. So are you going to be looking at legal norms, what would happen if you went to court? Are you looking at what the standards in the industry are, or some objective other standards? Or are you looking at the party's interest as the basis for a decision? One of the cases that the lawyers, one of the lawyers I talked about was telling me, I interviewed, talked about, was a couple where they were negotiating a divorce, and there was an issue about alimony or spousal support. And the normal way of doing it under the law would be to say, okay, there's going to be a fixed amount. The husband was going to pay wife X number of dollars per month. Well, they had a very detailed discussion about what their interests were, and they agreed that it would actually make more sense to do it as a percentage of the husband's interest. Well, they weren't using the standards of the law, the norms, the legal norms. They were using their own interests, their own values as the norm. So those are examples of some of the variables that people can think about and recognize that they don't all come together as these packages in these models that are known as distributor or positional negotiation on one hand, or interest-based or cooperative negotiation on the other.
And that sounds particularly important when speaking to an audience of students as you are now, who come from so many places in the world, walks of life, age groups, professions, and all sorts of other variables, and recognizing upfront that it's hard to provide them with a model that will work for them in their context, in their setting, and more to the point saying, here are the things you should be looking at, take these and then go make sense for yourself in whatever your own contexts are.
Yes.
I'm gonna take that as a very solid yes, and I think I'm just going to thank you for sharing that with our students. It sounds like something that students who want to spend more time on reflecting a little deeper into the material we've covered in this course can now take the notions that you've just raised and then go back and review the past few weeks in this course and look at it with a different eye, kind of looking at it, wait, so if things aren't this set piece, how can I grow through looking at this as a more kind of modular mix and match or tailor to my own approach? And that would be a very valuable exercise to conduct either at this point or right after the course is done.
And if they are truly gluttons for punishment, which, taking this course suggests that they probably already are to some extent, they could read my article, which is available on the website on ssrn.com, which you could probably provide the
I will
link
provide a link to it.
It's a law review article. It may be somewhat more theoretical than a lot of you will be interested in, but some of you may be interested in. And then I'm also updating a book that I've written called Lawyering with Planned Early Negotiation, and I have a chapter that summarizes this in a lot easier language. Just wanted to say those resources are available as well.
Perfect. I will provide the link to the article, and I will certainly recommend any lawyers out there certainly read John's book. I recommend that to many lawyers along the way. John, thank you so much.
My pleasure.